Hey, church, online friends. It's great to be here together with you today. I want to start our time off by sharing a story. Now, maybe it's a story that you can relate to. In the morning, when I wake up, I'll often go on my computer. I like to see what's going on in the world, check emails, sports scores, the news, go on Facebook. Now, oftentimes, Paige, my wife, will try to talk to me while I am on the computer. Now, this is problematic because I have a condition. I can't do two things at the same time. Now, I used to think I was fully capable of being on the computer and of listening, but full disclosure, I just can't do that anymore. Now, she'll say something like, "Can you change Reed's diaper before we go out?" And yes, I hear her, I hear the words, but it just doesn't register. I see an article about Tom Brady and the Buccaneers, and it just floats away. Next scene. Our kid smells really bad. Paige says, "Did you change the diaper like I asked?" Wait, what? Some of us have this problem. You might be nudging someone on the couch next to you right now. Or maybe you're on Facebook or you're checking sports scores right now, and you can't even hear me. Hey, over here. I believe that God wants our undivided attention. And so today we're going to be looking at the story of Moses and Moses' journey into the land of Midian, a wilderness, if you will. Now, I believe this language of wilderness is important to us because many of us are finding ourselves in a wilderness of sorts right now. We are uncomfortable, there is uncertainty, and we don't know what's ahead. So I would challenge you today that God has something for you in the wilderness. God has something for you in the wilderness. So a little bit of background on Moses. Moses was a Hebrew. As a child, he was adopted by his oppressors, the slaveholders, the Egyptians. And I can only imagine the identity crisis and trauma of his childhood. As he grew up, he saw the plight of his people, and he wanted to do something. He was keenly aware of the injustice being suffered by his people, and he wanted to fix it. One day, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, his people, and he reacts. He breaks and he kills the Egyptian. He tries to hide his sin by burying the body in the sand. The next day, he visits his people again and tries to help. They said, "We don't want your help." They were cynical and asked, "Do you mean to kill us too?" What had been under the surface his entire life had come out. His identity crisis, his anger. He could no longer ignore it. Moses flees his home, his relationships, his people, the people who raised him. I just imagine what that must have been like as he left Egypt. Perhaps he's afraid. He doesn't know where he's going or what he's going to do. He's confused about who he is. Is he Egyptian or is he Hebrew? He's probably trying to process how he fights injustice. How do I use anger in ways that don't kill others? All of these things are swirling around in his brain. Now, to illustrate this, I have a jar, and there's dirt and water. And I imagine everything swirling around for Moses. All of the confusion. It's hard to see clearly. Everything is cloudy. Shout out to Ruth Haley Barton for these thoughts and the illustration. But I imagine that as he takes steps away from Egypt, things became a little bit clearer. More like this jar of dirt and water. Things start to settle. And although we don't see God with Moses at this point, I believe that he was there helping Moses make sense of things. As he fled to Midian, he had time to process, to think, to pray, and to work through those things. I believe that he began to have some clarity about who he was and what he was going to do with his life. We next see Moses at a well in Midian. Daughters of Jethro, a local priest, are drawing water, and they are getting harassed by some shepherds. It says that Moses stood up and helped them and watered their sheep. Now the wilderness had done something to Moses. Something inside of him is different. He doesn't react the same way. He doesn't respond with violence and anger as he tries to help. It seems that his sense of justice was coming from another place. It seems like he was centered. He has control. Something inside of him has changed. Now here's the connection for us. During this wilderness time in our lives, all of our activities, our work, our social commitments, all that has come to a screeching halt. All the busyness, all of the chaos is gone. Now, like Moses, you are mostly alone, and all the dirt from your life is probably settling too. Things may become more and more clearer for you. You're able to see things a little bit differently. Now, this space helps us to realize what's important. The space helps us to realize who we are. The space helps us to hear from God. We have more margin and space to hear from him. Things aren't as clouded. We see this with Moses too. One day, Moses is in the wilderness. He is tending sheep. Something amazing happens. God shows up. Chapter 3, verse 2. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. He's talking to himself there. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. I believe that having this space, in this season in Moses' life, where he had some silence and some solitude, helped Moses to hear from God. God talked to Moses from a burning bush. That was really unexpected. Now, when we are busy and our water is clouded, our lives are clouded, it's harder to be open to the work of God in our lives. It's hard to hear him and to experience him in a new way. Now, during this time, as things are settling, God may be speaking to us in new ways, just like he was with Moses. Now, it may be through new devotions or new practices or new spiritual disciplines. It might be by finding a new place to pray. A question that I have for you is, how is God trying to get your attention? How is God trying to get your attention? Just as God was reaching out to Moses with a burning bush, what is God doing in your life where he's trying to get your attention? Now, my favorite part of this story is chapter 3, verse 4. And out of the NASB, it says this: When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush. Moses turned aside to look, and God was waiting until he had Moses' attention. Moses was ready to listen. Now, Moses could have been doing any number of things, but he decided that he was going to be fully present with God and to focus on what God was doing. He could have been looking down at his iPhone. He could have been focusing on planning his next steps and his return to Egypt. He could have been consumed by the local news, but he was not. The Lord waited until he turned his attention. He was waiting until Moses was fully present with what was going on. In our wilderness today, I believe that God is waiting for us to be fully present with him, for us to turn our attention and gaze towards him. Now, I believe today that God may be saying to some of us, are you paying attention? Or, like in my introductory story, are you on your computer? Are you doing other things? Are you distracted or preoccupied with yourself? Now, some of you are in a little bit different place. Some of you maybe are parents of younger children like I am. Maybe you are a caregiver or a healthcare worker, or you work in a grocery store. And so this time, this season, this wilderness, your life has actually picked up. Things have gotten more and more hectic, more and more chaotic right now. And it seems like instead of having some stillness, things are still crazy and hectic and cloudy in your life. Now, I believe that we should ask God into those spaces. Now, there's a powerful poem, a prayer, by Ted Yoder in his book, Gorillas of Grace. And I want to read it to us and for us. Holy One, there is something I wanted to tell you, but there have been errands to run, bills to pay, arrangements to make, meetings to attend, friends to entertain, washing to do. And I forget what I wanted to say to you, and mostly I forget what I'm about and why. What I want to ask in my blundering way is don't give up on me. What I wanted to ask is for peace enough to want and work for more, for joy enough to share, and for awareness that is keen enough to sense your presence here. Friends, may that be our prayer. Now, over the next few weeks, we are going to be following Moses as he takes God's people into the wilderness. We're going to be looking at this idea of wilderness in our life, because I think it's very pertinent to our experience today. Now, over this time, you will see a transformation of Moses. And as I close here, I want to fast forward through the book of Moses to Exodus 33, verse 11. I want to read it to you. It says, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to a friend." Friends, what if our primary goal, our primary focus during this time is to have a closer friendship with God, so that we could have a taste of what Moses had, that we might have a closer friendship with Jesus? My encouragement is don't waste this wilderness experience. Let's turn our gaze and our focus towards him.